What I would like to do is talk to you all indeed about the idea of preparing a piece of paper, because we've been using paper that we had purchased. The reason to do that was just to get our eyes on the copy and to get focused on the notion of recreating marks that we would see in works by great artists. It's very easy to just overload yourself and suddenly you're in a place where you don't quite understand what's going on, and then you default to assumptions and preconceived ideas, maybe even habits that you're trying to break. And so therefore, I think the operative thing to do now is to expand our dialogue and to talk a little bit more about how to prepare a piece of paper and what all that involves. So I need to go through a couple of things with you. The first is the paper itself. This is simply called Gutenberg laid. And Gutenberg is available if you ever want to get a sheet through a website called Talas Online, Talas Online, and they are an antiquarian bookbinding outfit. And you can get some pretty awesome papers, I think including Hahnemühle. And this may actually have been purchased by Hahnemühle, which is a German company. Anyway, you've got various options. This stuff comes in 31 by 41 pieces. And so we were talking about taking a piece of paper and cutting it down and cutting it down and cutting it down, which is an important thing because we all know that when we start looking at folks like Greuze and others, we're going to be studying works that are of a modest size. So think about working with smaller pieces. The other thing about selecting a paper is making sure that it has the right kind of surface that you would imagine being receptive to the material. And so if I were to grab a pastel pencil or something, I would want to see that the material is caught. The material is captured by the surface, and this stuff has a very nice textural quality. It's not very smooth, and it doesn't seem like it has that strange woven texture that Canson Metance has. So I'm neither a too textured or a too smooth person, especially when it comes to something like sepia or indeed red chalk. The texture of this is a little bit like a dollar bill. That's how I've always thought about it. When I was watching a series of paper discussions and demonstrations about paper making and paper manufacturing, this fellow who was the supervisor actually said that the reason, I guess it's not the whole reason, the reason to have a watermark, he said part of the reason was that artists are so stupid we don't know which side of the paper to work on. I mean, that's part of it. What you do is you hold it up to the window or the light box or whatever, and you try to read which is the right side to work on so that you don't make a mistake that way. But you also realize that some papers are very, very different on one side versus the other, and so you always have to cop the field test. And the field test is something that you definitely want to be mindful of before you tone your paper so that you don't tone the wrong side of the paper, okay? Once I have the paper laid out, I want to be mindful of just how subtle a tone could actually be. I've got a tone here which is obviously not white because it's on a white sheet of paper, and this is a photocopy, and that makes this a very slightly grayish tone. It's a beautiful tone to go after, and I thought we could maybe play around with this as a matter of toning the paper and go from there. Before we do that, there's a couple other things to talk about. This is all kind of procedural stuff and certainly very important, and so I hope you don't mind some remedial things here. But we're looking at a tone of the paper which I would classify as a kind of cold-ish gray, but I've got a warm paper. Now, I am one of these people that really likes a warm paper in the form of what you see here. I put this against a white foam core board so you could see the contrast. Do you see that? And the reason I like that is because I like the idea, as I'm drawing, of being able to chamois out a warm highlight versus insert via white chalk or white charcoal, as in this General's charcoal white pencil, a cold highlight. And so I'm always one that likes to use a slightly warmish paper like that if I can get my hands on it. So something to think about. It's up to you, obviously, but that's what I practice. We're going to try to go after this kind of tone, but in order to get ourselves there, I need to say a few things. You don't want to tone this flat, that is to say horizontal, like this, on a table, because what's going to happen is the paper is going to buckle like this once you tone it, and whatever you have on the paper is going to drop down into the crevices, into the pits of the paper, into the troughs, and the tone itself will essentially be removed from the crests of these waves. If you want something that looks very psychedelic, then tone your papers like that. But if you like tones that are a lot more uniform and succinct, I would suggest either putting the paper up like this vertically, or taking the paper, and this is one that's going to be fairly even, right, and tilting it about like that on a foam core board. I use a foam core board when I tone a paper because it's just easy to move around. Now, we were talking earlier about the notion of a store-bought tone, and you can see this is going to be the Fabriano, and this is going to be what I just made. There is something so much more, exponentially more inviting about drawing in this than there is about drawing in this. This has always felt to me a little bit antiseptic, drawing on a tone, but I swear by this. I think these are great to draw into. There's so much fun to draw into. If you tone, I think what you'll find as you tone your papers, as everybody usually does, that you will start toning and your first sheet's going to be decent, and your second sheet's going to be better, and your third sheet's going to be better and better. And I usually will spend half a day toning papers, and I'll take the ones that are not so good and I'll use those first. I'll use those in the studies that to me feel like they're possibly throwaway studies or warm-up studies. And I'll save the tones that feel like they're much more succinct and inviting for later times when I feel like I could take that piece and hold it and get it ready for a special event, you know, like drawing the recent one of Christina. And I used a tone that I held on to for that because it seemed like it would really pop the red chalk. Okay, so I've got myself a couple of different material items to share with you. Number one is going to be masking tape. Any masking tape that you have will be something that you want to look into acquiring. You always want to have masking tape in the studio. This is non-archival. It doesn't need to be archival. Number two is some kind of a tray. We would usually think of a tray you'd get at a bodega or something like that. Pretty simple tray. Don't make it deep. Don't make it heavy, because the bigger this thing is, the more you're going to fill it with water and the more tone you're going to waste. So have a modest sized tray, please. Next thing is the bristle brush you would find at the hardware store. The bristle brush that I'm referring to right here isn't the one that you would locate in the aisle where you'd find a house paint. This is the one that you'd get up at the counter next to the batteries and the chewing gum and whatever it is, you know, like the pocket flashlight. These are the cheapo ones, and I really like them, actually. I like the cheapo ones because what they do is they give you this Chinese bristle, and I always use a Chinese bristle, usually just like this, a 2-inch simple paintbrush to tone my papers. And then the other thing is, in terms of getting at your tone, trying to acquire something that's going to give you something nice to work into. I am favorable to a neutral-ish gray color, and so I'm going to assemble something that's kind of warm and something that's kind of cold or maybe very cold, and I'll mix those together in the form of watercolor. So I'm going to get 2 tubes of watercolor out, maybe 3, and one of those tubes is going to be raw umber. This right here is raw umber, and what I'm going to do with this raw umber, which doesn't look like it in the tube, it looks like a raw sienna, but I'm going to paint the bottom of that bin with the raw umber, and I'm just going to put down maybe a little bit. I don't need a whole lot because I'm not going to do a ton of toning tonight. The other one from Winsor Newton is going to be ultra blue, and I'm going to use a little bit of ultra blue as an ultramarine. I always do this. I use my 2 mainstays, which are ultra blue and raw umber, and then I usually add something unusual to that. That's going to be cerulean blue. So what we're going to be needing to do, folks, we're going to have a little bit of water that we can pour in this thing. We're going to need a tester, and it's usually good practice to have a tester paper towel as well as a tester piece of paper. And I'm not going to use one of these as a tester here, but I can tell you without a doubt, that's one of the things, if there were an issue that people seem to not abide by that causes problems, they usually don't have a sample piece of paper, and therefore they don't know what they're toning. They don't know how it's coming out because it does change as it dries, and that's going to be something that I want you to think about. The other thing is you actually have to take your piece of paper and tape it down fully. So I'm going to be doing that for a second just to allow this piece of paper to lay completely flat, because we're going to wet the entire thing. What we're going to do, in fact, is we're going to awaken the size in the paper, because when we start toning this thing, it's going to wet the paper, and the size is in the paper. It's a kind of glue, you know. So you see what I just did, folks? I laid these out, and my papers are now affixed fully to the piece of foam core. The next thing I'm doing here is I'm going to pour a little bit of water into this bin. Just a small amount. This is another key thing. You just don't want a whole lot of water. You just want a little bit. And that's why I'm advocating for a tester. Okay? So I put the water in. This is the hard part, because you can't really see a whole lot in the film, can you? It's not really clear. But they're in there, okay? And you can see that they haven't really been dissolved. So this is the next part of the process and procedure. You've got to take the brush out. You want to take the colors now and stir them thoroughly, because what usually happens is you are met with an unwelcome surprise in the middle of the brushes. You know, you think you got everything liquefied, and then you're toning your piece of paper, going about your business, and suddenly ultra blue comes back to avenge some sort of misuse of it in a prior painting, and you get this weird super dark blue streak in it. So now the big question is this dark enough? Is it not dark enough? You know, what's going on with this passage I just made? Because a couple things may happen. I might need to put more paint in here. I might need to put more water in here just to get things to work. So I'm going to use my tester sheet, and that's about what I'm getting in the tester sheet. That seems fairly good, but I'm willing to go with that to see what's going to happen. So I'll walk you through the procedure. Here's what you do, folks. You go up to the top of this and you lay out a bead. And once you lay out that bead, you carry that down the page, and you try your absolute best not to go back in and hit the areas you already hit, because that will create some streaking. And it's very difficult for artists to retain the self-control, especially when they're all hung over and they come into class. Some of them still drunk from the night before, to manage the self-discipline not to go back in. What I usually do at the end of this is I will turn the whole board upside down so that the thing it won't just all go that way. However, I can't do that here, so I'll just let it go where it's going. But you see what I've done? I've just pulled this like a curtain down the paper. I've pulled that like a curtain all the way down the page. And you can see that I really didn't get much done there, right? It wasn't dark enough. And that happens a lot. You get this situation where first one was a dud, and so now I know more. I have to load up the pigment, and so I am going to change my color. I'm going back in, and I'm adding more of this color that's called raw umber, in case I forgot to mention that. As you endeavor to get a really good tone, if you do it on a Sunday, then what you're going to be able to do, probably by hour 3 or something, is you're going to have the tone you always wanted. But it takes a while to get yourself there. It takes trial and error, a lot of error, and a lot of trial. But once you get there, you get a whole lot of really interesting looking tones. So now I've got that. You see it's a little bit more like a celadon color, celadon green color. So let's give that a shot. This should be a lot darker. But then you've got a beautiful tone, you know, and like I was saying, a very inviting tone. And it does work. Like I said, it creates a phenomenon on your paper. It allows your paper to be much more in the scope of the handmade, which I think is quite beautiful. When you get to handmade tones, they're so much more inviting to work into because they already have a special touch. You toned them and you made them in a way customized for what is to come later. It's a much better tone, isn't it? Let's use the remaining. Let's go back on top of the one that's still wet and see if we can impart some degree of change in there. I didn't add any more ultra blue. Instead I added the cerulean along with the raw umber. And I'm going to try not to overbrush this. That's what I'm getting. It's good to add a certain amount or degree of pigment in here because it's going to be riding over the edges of the ridges of the paper, the page, and you just want something nice and even like that. And it usually is pretty great because you can be thinking about a really great book that I'm aware of by an author named John DeMartin, who talks about specific parts of the range that you could make the paper accommodate. So you could tone your paper to whatever part of the range you want the home value to be or the paper to function as. Drawing to a 5, drawing to a 3, so on and so forth. What's even cooler is you're going to be activating your reds, your sepia colors, and it's just pretty cool to do that. But they're going to be unusually activated by the tone of the paper. That's what you're doing. So it winds up being a really wonderful practice because of so many different factors that are active within it. I was going along the bottom of the paper and I was eliminating the water just along the bottom of the page, and then I can take this area here and organize myself. And this is indeed how I would wind up allowing things to get set up, because it's all going to have this weird quality of being organic, I would say, around the edges. It's not the easiest thing to see on camera, but that's toning paper right there, you know. Even if you were doing a floater frame, it still looks beautiful. Like all this stuff around the edge. Imagine how kinetic all of this is going to be once you put a drawing in there. You're not even going to see that. And so it doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, it probably shouldn't be perfect because it's not going to be any fun if you could do an absolutely perfect tonality. The wrinkles will go away by themselves. It's just, at this point in time, they don't look like they're going to go away because they're getting a lot of light and shadow from my studio light here. But once this thing dries, it'll be dry by tomorrow, and they'll be flat as pancakes, and you can draw. This is my paper here, and it was buckled as can be when I first toned it. Flat as a pancake, as I said. And it didn't take all that long to do, so just be aware of that. Be patient with it. Leave it on or leave it up until such time as you really can tell that it's completely dry. It's still a little bit wet, but it's going to be a very nice paper indeed to play around with as you explore this fabulous kind of thing. Even this could work. I mean, it's more green obviously, but it's going to pop certain temperatures in Carb, Othello, Conte, whatever you like. Yeah, I mean, it'll be fun to work it up because we can see that, as John says in his book, there's a functioning value there that we haven't activated yet because we got no white chalk on it. But once we put some white chalk in there, this immediately turns into a middle tone in the skin of the face. And it could even be that we create opportunities for ourselves in doing this drawing for more modeling, more functional modeling, because our paper is a little bit deeper than the original. And I think a really valid thing to consider as each and every one of us discerns how to incorporate a lot of these ideas into a professional working methodology. And so, begin your master copy by toning your paper. You can search out a drawing that you like. Just take a look at the perimeter around the drawing image, at the paper temperature, at the paper value, at the paper color, and see if you could recreate something that resembles either the age, whatever characteristics you can discern from the paper itself. Try that. Thanks everybody. Appreciate your time.